Because understanding great literature is better than trying to read and understand yet another business book. On the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, we commit to reading, dissecting, and analyzing the great books of the Western canon. You know, those books, from Jane Austen to Shakespeare, and everything else in between, that you might have fallen asleep trying to read in high school. We do this for our listeners, the owner, the entrepreneur, the manager, or the civic leader who doesn't have the time to read, dissect, analyze, and leverage insights from literature to execute leadership best practices in the confusing and chaotic postmodern world we all now inhabit. Welcome to the rescuing of Western civilization at the intersection of literature and leadership. Welcome to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. Hello. My name is Hasan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 82. With our book today, a book so large and sweeping that it stands alongside epic tales such as The Brothers Karamazov, The Sea of Poppies, and even The Leatherstocking Tales and The Grapes of Wrath. It is a beast of a book that spans lifetimes, and it serves as the gold standard for world-building historical narratives. It is a book that intimidates even the strongest, most confident, and literate reader, and even the strongest, most confident, and most literate leader. We are going to talk about the background, and we're going to do a little commentary today as an introduction to a book that's going to take us a couple of years to get through. War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. And we pick up from the Penguin Classics edition of War and Peace with a translation by Anthony Briggs and an afterword by Orlando Figs. This Penguin Classics book version was covered and was reprinted in 2007 with the translation and the copyright published in 2005. Again, from Penguin Classics. We are going to read this book. It is a beast of a book, and we're going to start off trying to position this beast of a book with this translation and introduction by Anthony Briggs. So we're going to open with that. War and Peace was written during one of the few periods in Leo Tolstoy's life when he had a sense of tranquility and purpose. Superlatives are needed to describe him, a big, strong man with a formidable intellect, powerful emotions, and extraordinary qualities and defects that ran to extremes. He lived a long life and left behind work that fills 90 large printed volumes, the biggest and richest individual contribution to the treasure house of 19th century Russian culture. Leo Nikolaevich Tolstoy was born in 1828 into the Russian aristocracy at Yasnaya Polyana, 130 miles southwest of Moscow. His parents died when he was young, but he and his siblings grew up happily, cocooned by female relatives. At the age of 16, he entered the university at Kazan, but failed his courses and returned to Yasnaya, which he had just inherited. By then, age 19, he had contracted his first dose of venereal disease, a continuing risk during the following years of debauchery and gambling in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Tolstoy's largely autobiographical childhood was accepted by The Contemporary in 1852, the first writing he had submitted for publication. Despite its modest aims and rather dry realism, it was popular and was followed by Boyhood in 1854 and Youth in 1857. Even greater success attended the three-part Sevastopol in December, May, and August 1855 to 56, which presented his experiences and observations as an artillery officer while leading men under fire during the Crimean War, 1854 to 1856, and undermined the false glamour of warfare. He soon became well known in St. Petersburg literary circles, though he found celebrity uncongenial and hurried back to Yasnaya. Tolstoy was occupied with War and Peace throughout the 1860s. The serious writing began in 1863, just as his first son was born. His wife, Sonia, short form of Sofia Andreyanova, was only 18, and she bore him another 12 children. He devoted the 1870s to Anna Karenina. By the way, pause. We'll be reading Anna Karenina on the podcast next season as well. Picking back up. And despite his artistic and commercial successes, he became obsessed by thoughts of his own mortality and tormented by a religious yearning that could not be reconciled with the activities of the church. And he thought constantly about suicide. This spiritual crisis is minutely described in A Confession, 1878 to 1879. Eventually he came through it, but his life was radically changed. He now avoided society, living and working at Yasnaya Polyana, wearing a peasant shirt and doing much manual work. He renounced writing, violence, stimulants of all kinds, including meat eating, and he required impeccable moral standards of all. This was his new religion, the best of Jesus, without his church. His moral stance, especially his pacifism, attracted interest from all over the world, and Tolstoyan communities were formed in several countries by disciples. But he was impossible to live with. His lack of love and charity toward those closest to him, especially his wife, remains a blot on his reputation. He did continue to write, including The Death of Ivan Ilyich, Resurrection, and Hajj Marat, and a moving 5-act tragedy of gruesome subject matter, The Power of Darkness. But at the age of 82, Tolstoy, estranged from all his family except for one daughter, Alexandra, fled with her for a monastery. He fell ill at a now famous railway junction where he died. His body was interred at the top of a small ravine at Yasnaya, where as a small boy he had searched for a little green stick on which was supposedly inscribed a secret formula guaranteeing permanent happiness and brotherly love. Once, many years ago, I wrote a short story, and I can't locate it right now, about the death of Leo Tolstoy. This has to be back when I was maybe 16 or 17 years old, because I was fascinated by the idea of a man of Tolstoy's, an author of Tolstoy's stature, dying in a train station, not wanting to be touched by anyone. So you could say, if you're really thinking about this, I have been personally probably obsessed with Leo Tolstoy as a figure for the better part of 30 years. War and Peace is a difficult book, and I've never actually tackled this book before. I have read Anna Karenina, and I look forward to reading it again. I've read The Death of Ivan Ilyich, and I've read several other Tolstoy books. But War and Peace is a beast, and it's a beast for many reasons. Leo Tolstoy was born in 1828 and died in 1910, so his life spanned almost the entirety of the long 19th century. that really began with the American Revolution and ended with World War I. He is quite possibly, along with Fyodor Dostoevsky and Anton Chekhov, one of the top 3 greatest Russian writers of the 19th century, and globally, one of the greatest writers of all time. And Dostoevsky, who he knew, and Tolstoy usually battle for 1 and 2 in Russian literature. But I think a romantist like Tolstoy, well, it depends upon where you're oriented towards, right? If you're more oriented towards a dour, cynical, dark view of humanity, you're going to go more in the direction of Dostoevsky. And we've covered Crime and Punishment on this podcast, and we were scheduled to cover the Brothers Karamazov. We'll be doing that next year. But Tolstoy with Anna Karenina and now War and Peace does stand as a giant right next to Dostoevsky in how we think about the Russian mind. He received nominations for the Nobel Prize in Literature every year from 1902 to 1906, and he received nominations for the Nobel Peace Prize in 1901, 1902, and 1909. Beginning in his late teens, Tolstoy wrote consistently for his entire life, documenting his life, the life of the Russian people, and eventually the life of human experience. And we saw that reflected in that introduction that we read. Look, Tolstoy was one of those rare people, one of those rare talents that was able to take the thing, the officion, such as it were, his passion, combine it with some discipline, and then shake it up with all of his experiences and spit out works that everyone, regardless of where they came from in the world, could relate to. From childhood, boyhood, and youth to Anna Karenina, Tolstoy used the genre of literature to explore not only the depths of other people, but also the depths of himself. And that's really what you get when you start to read War and Peace, or Anna Karenina, or The Death of Ivan Ilyich, or Childhood, Boyhood, and Youth. What you get is this idea that before Freud came along and before psychology really hit its peak in the middle part of the 20th century, Tolstoy was doing with his own experiences what Freud and Carl Jung would later do with science. He was trying to figure out what made himself tick. And I find it interesting that he was buried at Yasnaya Polyana, his property, after his death, where he had searched as a small boy for a little green stick where supposedly was inscribed a secret formula for guaranteeing permanent happiness and brotherly love, which is something that Tolstoy was searching for all his life. And he looked in the church, he looked in marriage, he looked in family, he looked in gambling and debauchery, he looked in every place, he even looked in his own heart, and he couldn't find it anywhere. So in order to understand War and Peace, we actually have to position War and Peace as a book beyond just in the human experience. Human beings exist in history. And so we have to talk about the history that surrounds War and Peace and the sweep of it. And so we're going to go back to the introduction that we are reading from here by the translator, Anthony Briggs, and we're going to pick up with his ideas, his thoughts on the history and philosophy behind War and Peace as a way to contextualize the war part and to contextualize the peace part. The inclusion of Tolstoy's reflections on the workings of history and the methods used by historians has always been controversial. But the common accusation that these musings bog down the novel, making it a struggle to get through, is quite false. At an early stage, he realized the danger of this, he meaning Tolstoy, and swept them all out of the main story into an appendix, the epilogue part 2. The few that are left are discreetly deployed. A short reflective passage is sometimes used to punctuate events, for example, to introduce new sections in a measured and thoughtful manner. See the opening chapters of all 3 parts of Volume 3. The epilogue itself may seem too long or repetitive, but it certainly adds to the scope of the novel and should not be ignored. Tolstoy's ideas on warfare history and historians are still relevant to the modern world. Consider, for instance, the following quotation from Sir Winston Churchill. Quote, "Never, never, never believe that any war will be smooth and easy. The statesman who yields to war fever must realize that, once the signal is given, he is no longer the master of policy, but the slave of unforeseeable and uncontrollable events." Close quote. This is a sharp summary of one concept developed by Tolstoy in the epilogue. Another example can be seen in the popular political view that when the British Prime Minister retired from office in 2007, he did so having secured peace in Ireland after generations of bloody conflict, and that this was perhaps the most important part of his quote-unquote legacy. Mr. Blair pulled the levers, peace resulted. Do you believe it? Tolstoy tells us that this is an unsophisticated view of how history works. It is probably truer to say that Mr. Blair happened to be in the right place and thus eligible for credit at a time when all the multitudinous circumstances leading up to the final peace settlement, war weariness among them, came together to end the conflict for good. It could have been the previous prime minister or the next one or somebody else. It happened to be Tony Blair. These are the kinds of ideas that Tolstoy advances in his epilogue. His general purpose is to debunk. Most of all, he wants to cut Napoleon down to size, not only because he was a hated enemy of Russia, but because he was also a ludicrous figure of overweening, pompous pride. At the same time, Tolstoy is keen to take issue with the traditional writers of history who distort the truth by their narrow-minded attitudes and oversimplification. As Henry Gifford wrote, quote, "War and Peace has its pages of pamphleteering, but they cannot be torn out because the argument is continuous. On every page lies the imprint of the same evolving experience." Close quote. The 1860s were a golden decade in Russian literature. In 1862, Ivan Turgenev published Fathers and Children, and Fyodor Dostoevsky was at his most prolific, issuing Notes from Underground in 1864, Crime and Punishment in 1866, The Idiot in 1867-68, and starting to work on Devils in 1869. A measure of the achievement of War and Peace is that it transcends even these masterpieces. Virginia Woolf made the point succinctly, quote, "There remains the greatest of all novelists, for what else can we call the author of War and Peace?" So the sweep of War and Peace covers the period in Russia between 1805 and 1820, a period of time that occurred before Dostoevsky himself was born in 1828. But this was a very pivotal point in Russian history and in European history in general, because in 1805, the Napoleonic Wars were 2 years into their commencement. Now, we mentioned, or Briggs mentions, Napoleon in the introduction and Tolstoy's desire to cut Napoleon down to size. And during the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon, the Corsican general, threw 500,000 men against Russia in 1812. And actually, he didn't just do this once in 1812. He did it twice, first in 1807 and then in 1812, in an attempt to return them, humbled, to the grand game of European imperial affairs, a grand game that Napoleon himself was setting the rules for and was dictating the terms, at least initially. Now, in that second invasion of Russia in 1812, the forced marching and then fighting and then marching back to France across the Russian steppes, combined with Cossacks' guerrilla warfare tactics, a lack of adequate supplies, and disease, caused Napoleon's Grande Armée to be decimated in an act that demonstrated, based on geography, not necessarily strategy, that the great man, the great general, the great Corsican, well, he was full of human inadequacy and human imperfection, just like anyone else. It's impossible for us in our day, in the year of our Lord, 2023, it's impossible for us as postmodern capitalists in America who live in societies, not only in America, a society in America, but live in societies globally now, where honor-based monarchical governing systems have just mostly become anachronisms. It's impossible for us to imagine or to understand just how much psychological pressure the mere presence a guy like Napoleon asserted on everyone in Europe, from the average peasant on the street or on the steppes of Russia, all the way up to the highest folks in government. His mere presence at the beginning of the 19th century was a revolutionary challenge in a way that no other general had been, or no other figure honestly had been, probably since the pre-Enlightenment days of the Protestant Reformation, with Martin Luther throwing himself against the Catholic Church. The knock-on effects of the pressure from Napoleon's efforts to unite Europe underneath a French banner, the knock-on effects occurred in Russia, and one of them was the Crimean War, fought in the 1850s, where Tolstoy actually served and saw firsthand what warfare looked like. Thus, he could take that warfare experience in the Crimean War campaign, and he could project backward based on Russian myth and Russian legend during his own time, and the legends that he grew up of Napoleon during his boyhood. He could project that back, and thus set a narrative for history, a narrative for Russian history that sought to take the French and, by extension, take Europe and put it in a box. Something that, ironically, I already mentioned that this is 2023, and by the time you listen to this, this event may or may not be over, but it's something that is being repeated right now with Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. It turns out that history doesn't take a vacation, and even writers don't get a vacation from history. Now, at one level, War and Peace is influenced by Tolstoy's psychological experiences in the Crimean War, translated backwards, as I already said. But at another level, War and Peace is an attempt to frame Russian victories against powerful external forces and to provide Russia, to provide the Russian people with a triumphant grand narrative at a time when the serfs were being freed, and, well, the end of the monarchical era was approaching, and the rise of Marxism and a guy named Lenin was about to show up. By the way, not the Beatle, the other guy, was about to show up and throw Russia and all of that grand narrative into the dustbin in order to create an all-new man. Tolstoy knew that you need narratives. You need grand narratives to create a new man, and grand political theories won't quite cut it. But when you don't have the ability to tell a story, and all you have is the ability to spin a narrative, well, at the base of that narrative are going to lie an enormous number of dead bodies. Back to the book, back to War and Peace, our introductory episode today, covering a book, once again, that is massive and sprawling. We're going to be in the introduction for a little while. But Tolstoy knows that you cannot spend all your time philosophizing. The sheer thrill of being alive, the excitement of surrendering to the moment and reveling in pleasure are infectiously represented in a series of set pieces. Sometimes the occasion is exquisite enough to be the high point in an individual's life. It is hard to imagine Count Ilya Rostov ever being any happier than when he dances the Daniel Cooper at home, Volume 1, Part 1, Chapter 17, unless it is when he proposes a toast to General Bagration at a lavish dinner that he has put on at the English Club with money he cannot afford to spend. Chapter 2, or Volume 2, Part 1, Chapter 3. For senior soldiers, there is the glorious opportunity to be noticed by the emperor, hence the obsequious behavior of an elderly general before Tsar Alexander I, and the suicidal rush into the river Vistula by a Polish general anxious to please Napoleon, which cost the lives of 40 men, but wins him a medal. Even young Petya Rostov is borne away with mindless rapture at the mere sight of the Tsar. By contrast, almost all the younger characters find sublime happiness in falling in love, and at one point the entire Rostov household seems to be dizzy from it. Quote, "Love was in the air at the Rostovs at this time, as it always is when there are very young and very charming girls around. Any young man arriving at their house and seeing those young girls' faces so sensitive and always smiling, probably at their own good fortune, amid all the chasing and scurrying and hearing all their frivolous girlish chatter, so good-natured, open to everything, brimming with hope, and their equally frivolous singing and music-making, enjoy the same sensations of love-sickness and impending bliss that the young Rostovs were themselves enjoying." Close quote. There are many occasions for tears of joy. Dancing is one such. For example, Natasha's instinctive Russian dancing after the hunt is a reminder of her father's happy evening with the Daniel Cooper, her own unspeakable delight at her first ball, whirling around with Prince Andrei, and Denisov's amazing mazurka at Iogel's. It is useful to emphasize such bliss, not least because Russian literature has a reputation for gloomy introspection, which is only partly deserved. It gives the novel its most unusual quality. Tolstoy's ability to lead us through disappointment, frustration, and tragedy without bitterness or cynicism. He declares, against all odds, the goodness of living. This is the spirit of the whole novel. You will see it at its best in Volume 2, Part 4, all 13 chapters. War and Peace, just like life, is not all high drama all of the time. There are set pieces, as was just mentioned in that little piece that I was reading, that punctuate the narrative and give a character a moment in life. This is something that Tolstoy struggled with, particularly when he was a young man, where he was a decadent raconteur, a decadent man about town. And then much later on in his life, when he discovered, as I mentioned before, Jesus, but without mercy, he moved in the other direction that a decadent usually does. He sort of did his own version of becoming Augustine of Hippo a little bit, except he was the Augustine of Russia. Now, Tolstoy, in War and Peace, uses these set pieces in the characters' lives to echo the types of experiences we have in our own lives, from birthdays to holidays to marriages and finally to our own funerals. This is one way human beings combine the philosophy of meaning with the practicality of life. And when we miss out on those patterns or on those rituals, we fail to find meaning, or we struggle to find it. Matter of fact, a lot of us in a postmodern context who no longer eat together as families on a regular basis can struggle to find meaning. Speaking of living in a postmodern era, when those patterns are not functional, like eating together around a dinner table with no cell phones, when instead those are dysfunctional, or when a culture has robbed those patterns, those rituals of meaning, of their meaning, due to the long impact of grinding nihilism, what would have been merely passé in another era becomes riddled with meaning, or, on the other side, contains no meaning at all. At a certain point, you have to move from a theory of living, a philosophizing of living, into the actual practical act of living. And Tolstoy, in War and Peace, balances the cycles of living and nests them into a grand epic of human beings' lives. And not just their lives, but also their loves, their connections, their relationships, and of course, their pursuits. Back to the book, back to the introduction to Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. We're rounding the corner here, getting ready to close on our episode today. Although War and Peace has often been described as the greatest novel ever written, Tolstoy once claimed it wasn't a novel at all. Henry James, giving the title as Peace and War, called it a fluid pudding and included it in a list of large, loose, baggy monsters. By contrast, it has been compared to the Iliad in scope and technique, and Prince Dmitry Mirsky, the distinguished émigré historian of Russian literature, called it the most important work in the whole of Russian realistic fiction. Tolstoy's protestation that it wasn't a novel had a particular purpose. He wanted his readers to expect something broader and deeper than the romances they were used to finding in fiction. There would be no single hero and heroine, no straightforward system of exposition, crisis and resolution, no orthodox ending. It was a book in which Tolstoy made up new rules as it expanded, a society novel that turned into a family story, only to grow into a historical chronicle and a mighty epic that was underwritten by a deep interest in individual destinies and intimate human detail. It was a 15-year tranche of human experience, 1805 to 1820, fictional and real, located in Russian society in an age of critical importance for Europe as a whole, and Tolstoy made an unprecedented attempt to bring together the widest possible range of interests, personal, social, psychological, and historical. But most important is his instinctive skill as a teller of stories and creator of characters. The lasting quality of War and Peace lies in its compelling narrative and fascinating people, imagined and historical. Perhaps Peace and War might have been a more appropriate title, because only about a third of the action takes place on or near the battlefield. Anyone coming to this novel for the first time can be assured of one thing: you are going to enjoy some very good stories. But first, we need to sketch in some background. Tolstoy begins his novel by throwing an evening party to welcome his characters and his readers. The year is 1805, and Napoleon's aggressive actions, especially the recent seizure of Genoa and Lucca, seem likely to threaten Russia's western boundaries. The huge and bumbling Pierre Buzakov and the neat, self-assured Prince Andrei Bolkonsky are guests, and their maturation and misadventures will form the main interest of the novel. At first, the two young men have everything going for them. Pierre inherits a huge fortune and marries well. The efficient Andrei will find success in all that he does as a landowner and soldier. But both of these gifted and fortunate men will make many mistakes, feel constantly unhappy with the course of their lives, take appallingly bad decisions, and have to live with the consequences. The same applies to the leading female character, Natasha, whose progress from childhood to full maturity is so convincingly depicted that she has been described as certainly the most wonderfully made character in any novel. The strength of War and Peace is in the weakness of its characters. The novel is a detailed casebook of human inadequacy and imperfection, so many avoidable errors are made that it will be a long time before contentment and equilibrium start to emerge, and for some of the characters, new insight comes too late. Oscar Wilde said that what made Russian writers' books so great is the pity they put in them. They have seen life, tackled it, and tried their best, as they know a truth that rarely declares itself, especially in stories that are meant for entertainment. It is this: virtually everyone, even people in advantageous or privileged circumstances, finds the living of life a worrying and difficult business most of the time. And then we're going to move to our introduction, from our introduction to War and Peace, into Part 1, Chapter 1 of War and Peace. Well, Prince, Genoa, and Lucca are now nothing more than estates taken over by the Bonaparte family. No, I give you a fair warning. If you won't say this means war, if you will allow yourself to condone all the ghastly atrocities perpetrated by that Antichrist, yes, that's what I think he is, I shall disown you. You're no friend of mine, not the faithful slave you claim to be, but how are you? How are you keeping? I can see I'm intimidating you. Do sit down and talk to me." These words were spoken in French one evening in July 1805 by the well-known Anna Pavlovna Scherer, maid of honor and confidant of the Empress Maria Feodorovna, as she welcomed the first person to arrive at her soiree, Prince Vasily Kuragin, a man of high rank and influence. Anna Pavlovna had had a cough for the last few days, and she called it la grippe. Grippe being a new word not yet in common currency. A footman of hers in scarlet livery had gone around that morning delivering notes written in French, each saying precisely the same thing. "If you have nothing better to do, Count or Prince, and if the prospect of spending an evening with a poor sick lady is not too unnerving, I shall be delighted to see you at my residence between 7 and 10. Annette Scherer." "My goodness, what a violent attack," replied the prince, who had only just come in and was not in the least put out by this welcome. Dressed in his embroidered court uniform with knee breeches, shoes, and stars across his chest, he looked at her with a flat face of undisturbed serenity. His French was the elegant tongue of our grandparents, who used it for thought as well as speech, and it carried the soft tones of condescension that come naturally to an eminent personage grown old in high society and at court. He came up to Anna Pavlovna and kissed her hand, presenting her a perfumed and glistening bald pate, and then seated himself calmly on the sofa. "First things first," he said, "how are you, my dear friend? Put my mind at rest." His voice remained steady, and his tone, for all its courtesy and sympathy, implied indifference and even gentle mockery. "How can one feel when one is suffering in a moral sense? Can any sensitive person find peace of mind nowadays?" said Anna Pavlovna. "I do hope you're staying all evening." "Well, there is that reception at the English ambassador's. It's Wednesday. I must show my face," said the prince. "My daughter is coming to take me there." "I thought tonight's festivities had been cancelled. I must say all those celebrations and fireworks are becoming rather tedious." "If they had known you wanted the celebration cancelled, it would have been," the prince said with the predictability of a wound-up clock. Sheer habit made him say things he didn't even mean. "Stop teasing me. Come now. Tell me, what's been decided about Novositlov's dispatch? You know everything." "What is there to tell?" replied the prince in a cold, bored tone. "What's been decided? They've decided that Bonaparte has burnt his boats, and I'd rather think we're getting ready to burn ours." Prince Vasily always spoke languidly, like an actor declaiming a part from an old play. Anna Pavlovna Scherer was just the opposite, all verve and excitement despite her 40 years. To be an enthusiast had become her special role in society, and she would sometimes wax enthusiastic when she didn't feel like it, so as not to frustrate the expectations of those who knew her. The discreet smile that never left her face, though it clashed with her faded looks, gave her the appearance of a spoilt child with a charming defect that she was well aware of, though she neither wished nor felt able to correct it, nor even thought it necessary to do so. Then suddenly, in the middle of this political discussion, Anna Pavlovna launched forth in great excitement. "Oh, don't talk to me about Austria. Perhaps it's all beyond me, but Austria has never wanted war, and she still doesn't want war. She's betraying us. Russia alone must be Europe's savior. Our benefactor is aware of his exalted calling, and he'll live up to it. That's the one thing I do believe in. The noblest role on earth awaits our good and wonderful sovereign, and he's so full of decency and virtue that God will not forsake him. He will do what has to be done and scotch the hydra of revolution, which has become more dreadful than ever in the person of this murdering villain. We must alone avenge the blood of the righteous. And whom can we trust, I ask you? England, with that commercial spirit of hers, cannot understand the lofty soul of our Emperor Alexander, and never will. She has refused to evacuate Malta. She keeps on looking for an ulterior motive behind our actions. What did they say to Novositlosev? Nothing. They didn't understand. They're not capable of understanding how altruistic our emperor is. He wants nothing for himself, but everything for the good of mankind. And what have they promised? Nothing. And what little have they promised they won't carry out? Prussia has already declared that Bonaparte is invincible, and that the whole of Europe is powerless to oppose him. I, for one, don't believe a single word from Hardenberg or Haugwitz. That much vaunted Prussian neutrality is just a trap. I put my faith in God and the noble calling of our beloved emperor. He'll be the savior of Europe. She stopped suddenly, amused at her own passionate outburst. I think if they had sent you instead of our dear Witzengerode, said the prince with a similar smile, an onslaught like this from you would have gotten the King of Prussia to agree. You are so eloquent. May I have some tea? Yes, of course, by the way, she added, calming down. There are two very interesting men coming here tonight. The Vicomte de Montmort, a Montmorency, through the Rohan line, one of the best French families. He's the right kind of emigre, one of the genuine ones. And the Abbé Morio, such a profound thinker. Do you know him? He's been received by the emperor. Have you heard? Oh, it will be a pleasure to meet them, said the prince. But tell me, he added with a studied nonchalance, as if an idea had just occurred to him, though this question was the main reason for his visit. Is it true that the Dowager Empress wants Baron Funke to become first secretary in Vienna? They do say he's a miserable creature, that baron. Prince Vasily wanted this post for his son, but other people were working through the Empress Maria Fyodorova to get it for the baron. Anna Pavlovna half closed her eyes to indicate that neither she nor anyone else could pass judgment on what the Empress might feel like doing or want to do. Baron Funke has been recommended to the Dowager Empress by her sister, was all she said in a dry, lugubrious tone. As she pronounced the name of the Empress, Anna Pavlovna's face took on an expression of profound and sincere devotion, mixed with respect and tinged with sadness, which invariably came upon her when she had occasion to mention her exalted patroness. She said that Her Majesty had been gracious enough to show Baron Funke great respect, at which her face once again dissolved into sadness. War and Peace opens with a party. And all of the partygoers gather in their masses, just like witches at black masses. Pache, Ozzy Osbourne, and Black Sabbath. In the days before mass communication, people would get together. I know this is kind of weird in our time, where we only get together. Remember those rituals I was talking about? We only get together around holidays or around special celebrations. But in the days before mass communication, mass newspapers, mass transit, mass television, people would get together and exchange information from the humblest village to the highest potentate. And parties, especially social events, were opportunities to mold statecraft, as you could hear from Anna Pavlovna Scherer there. There were opportunities to mold statecraft, but they were also opportunities to perform in person everything, all the acts of behavioral management and human management that people perform now on their smartphones via TikTok. And the TikTok dancers now gather in their masses, just like witches had black masses. Well, women, just then as now, often control the flow of information. And it wasn't, and you see this in Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, and you also saw this in Shakespeare's plays, particularly Midsummer Night's Dream and The Tempest. Women control the flow of information, right? And they wielded great influence over communication channels, particularly at the aristocratic levels, as they do now, even in our post-industrialized time. As a matter of fact, the great French ambassador, Talleyrand, who worked with Napoleon and then worked against Napoleon, did a lot of his diplomatic dealings through women he happened to be romancing, because they could move across borders in Europe during the Napoleonic Wars and afterward without being suspected of carrying a thing. Many women, when they held these parties, many society women, behaved just like generals. Remember, I opened up there with Ozzy Osbourne, organizing their troops, resupplying and shoring up defensive positions in conversations, and in general, behaving like they were Napoleon. Everyone has their own little area, right, that they cotton to. Everyone has their own little skill sets. And it's interesting that War and Peace opens with a party, because Anna Pavlovna Scherer is going to be somewhat pivotal, at least at the beginning, to get the action flowing and get the action going. And Tolstoy wanted to start the book in a place that people would either recognize as being a place they may have once been, or they would recognize it as a place they had heard of, or they would recognize it as something that was happening, that they were aspiring to. So as we close this episode, this introduction to War and Peace this month on the podcast, I encourage you to listen in subsequent months and subsequent seasons to us break down War and Peace. We will be revisiting this book. It's so big, as I mentioned before, it's almost like City of God. We could have to break it down into multiple episodes and do it over a long course of time. But you'll be able to follow the narrative, and eventually, one of the things we'll do is we'll put all of our podcast episodes together. That way you'll be able to watch all of War and Peace all together, or listen to all of War and Peace all together all at once. But we will stick with the version that we have here. And just so that you know, I'm already knee-deep into Volume 1 of War and Peace. But what did we learn from the introduction today? How can we use this information to stay on the path as leaders, right? Because this is a leadership podcast, right? What can we learn from understanding the basic structure, Tolstoy's approach, the context in which War and Peace is written, and of course, how War and Peace begins? What can leaders take from all this information? What are the nuggets they can actually apply to their real lived leadership lives? Well, one of the first nuggets is this, and it does come from honestly, from how Leo Tolstoy lived his life. Be consistent, right? That's the first lesson that leaders can learn. Be consistent in whatever it is that you pick, whatever it is you choose to take action in, wherever it is that you choose to make your mark, showing up every day, in and out, whether you feel like it or not, is critical for success. We don't like the word discipline in our postmodern era, but it is discipline that creates talent. Yeah, you need afición, you need passion, such as was referred to in The Sun Also Rises when Jake was talking about bullfighting. But you also need consistency and discipline, and that's what Tolstoy had. It takes consistency and discipline to actually write a novel like War and Peace and everything else that Tolstoy ever wrote. The second thing that we can take from the introduction and from the understanding of War and Peace is that human inadequacy and human imperfection will always hit leaders, whether you're leading the charge, a suicidal charge against Napoleon's forces, and you're a Polish general, or whether you are Napoleon himself. Even the greatest man has foibles and imperfections. Now, this is something we're very familiar with in our postmodern era. As a matter of fact, as leaders, we are surrounded by people who are constantly seeking to bring down others, seeking to bring down, to paraphrase from Teddy Roosevelt, the man in the arena. Leaders, you will have human inadequacies and you will have human imperfections. But that doesn't give you license to make stupid mistakes. It doesn't give you license to do things that are immoral or unethical. It merely gives you license to apologize for things that you are genuinely wrong in doing, not apologizing for things that you did not do that are not wrong, and not apologizing for things you did do that aren't wrong. Understanding those distinctions with the difference in our postmodern era is definitely something that comes through, not only in Tolstoy's life, but also in War and Peace. The fourth thing that we can take from this book is that at some point you have to move from philosophizing and thinking to action. And that is one of the things we've talked about all this year. How do you take action? 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 How do you move from thinking about all of this stuff to actually activating on it? How do you move from organizing your people, organizing your masses, such as it were, on a computer screen, or marshaling your resources? How do you move from that into the point where you're actually moving against an enemy, or moving against or towards an object or a goal? At a certain point, you have to move from thinking to doing. And that point, I would assert, in the world today, is right now. Finally, leaders, gather your masses together. Open with a party, make some decisions about how you're going to open towards your objectives. Are you going to do something that's consistent with the strategy that you've already picked? Or are you going to pick a tactic that's so befuddling to the enemy that they will have no clue what is happening? And then, just like in War and Peace, you wind up drawing them into a morass that winds up being 1,600 pages long and winds up bogging them down. But you knew where you were going. You knew the whole entire time. One last point about War and Peace, and then I'll sign off here. The novel War and Peace is a long game, and just like life, just like Tolstoy's life, just like your life, it is not short. Life is long. Life is sometimes a slog without understanding and appreciating the little things. But it is understanding that life is long and that it will go on, and that you must make a plan and have something to joyfully look forward to that buoys us as leaders. It raises us up. We're talking about War and Peace during the month where we looked at the 7 pillars of wisdom, where we looked at Bury My Heart and Wounded Knee, where we looked at and read Last of the Mohegans. A month of warfare, a month of colonialization, a month where we looked at the effects and the ravages of genocide on peoples. Russia in the 19th century was in a transitional period, and Tolstoy lived through almost all of it. Transitional periods do come about once or twice every generation, and sometimes an entire generation gets to live through a transitional period and affect change. Leaders, you can affect change if you have the right strategy, the right target, and you understand when to engage in war and when to engage in peace. And well, that's it for me. Thank you for listening and subscribing to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. If you're listening to this on any of the major podcast players, like iTunes, Google Podcasts, or Spotify, please go ahead and leave us a 5-star review and write a little bit in there. A couple of sentences is good enough. That actually helps us game those algorithms that I was just maybe addressing. And, of course, it helps us grow the show. Tell all your family, tell all your friends, and tell the leaders in your life that you know that need to be listening to this show that this show exists. By the way, if you want to get started on the leadership path yourself, or you know some people who need to go on the leadership path, HSCT Publishing, the home company of Leadership Toolbox and Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, can help you and your team do that. So check out our training webinars, coaching services, and more at leadershiptoolbox.us. We are remote, we're live, we're in person, we're on video, and we've got leadership development solutions for your civic group, nonprofit staff, public sector staff, or even your private sector leaders. And of course, you're going to want to check out our video-based subscription service at leadingkeys.com. That's leadingkeys.com for leadership development on demand. You don't like videos, you don't like training, but you really like the podcast? Well, I would also recommend reading a book. Matter of fact, I'd recommend reading my most recent book, 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership. You can get that in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Ingram Spark, and any other place that you order books online. Finally, of course, we're on YouTube just like everybody else is. We'd love to have you help us grow the YouTube channel, so like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the HSCT Publishing channel on YouTube. Just search for HSCT Publishing, or you can search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button. Subscribing helps us grow the show, as it does with the audio, just is the same with the video. All right, that's it for me.